want to tell you about this time that I had to come up with $1 million for something that God asked me to do. And I know that sounds crazy, but this is a true story. So my wife and I moved to New York City about 10 years ago, in part because she's an actress in musical theater, and that was the place to be. Yeah. And in part because we had this stirring that God wanted us to do something big, something to do with church planting in New York City. And I wish I had time to go through all the different ways that God kind of reached into our life and let us know that that is what he wanted. But it's probably the clearest sense of calling I've had about anything in my life. But then when we got connected to a church planting organization and got into the middle of it, I'd never been on that side of running an organization and just seeing how much things cost for the generous ministry stuff we wanted to do, people's payroll for ministry staff and all the stuff that goes along with that, and facilities and all the stuff that goes along with that, and insurance and just all kinds of stuff. And of course, this is Manhattan, which is a very expensive place. And even though we tried to come up with, maybe that number doesn't sound like it could be the case for you, but we really tried to come up with a shoestring budget. And the price tag of what we needed to raise in donations before we could start was just about $1 million. And I don't know about you, but I can't just go into my pocket for $1 million. I mean, that was crazy talk. An impossible figure. The most money I had ever raised for anything, ever, was like $300 for a short-term mission trip that I went on. And I had to ask everybody I knew, and I had to ask a couple of them 2 times, and I had to go before a Sunday school class at my church and do a presentation and get $50 from them or whatever. So to raise, I'd never raised $1,000, let alone $10,000, let alone $100,000, let alone $1 million. It was just totally impossible. I was working as a middle school math teacher at the time, and I needed God to provide. Flat out, there was no other way. If I was going to do this thing, I needed God to provide. And I bring that story up today because that is something that every single one of us is going to need at some point in your life, at many points in your life. In fact, there are probably many of you here right now that need something from God. You may even be here this week because you need something from God. And maybe it's something big, or maybe it actually is a financial thing, like you're going to school and you don't know, or the textbooks are way more expensive than you thought and you don't know where that money's going to come from, or you feel called to do some kind of ministry thing and you have no idea how you're going to do it. But sometimes there are even things that are seemingly little things. Like the other day I went out to lunch with my parents, and my mom was saying some things, and I started to feel like I kind of need to challenge her on something. And even though I'm a grown man, I still love my mom, and I respect her, and I don't want to hurt her feelings, and I wasn't quite sure how to say what I felt like I needed to say. And so I kind of excused myself and slipped off to the bathroom and just gave myself a moment in there, and I said, God, I need the right words. I'm not sure exactly how to say this. I just needed God to provide. And so for you, it might be like, there's some stuff that just you keep thinking about and you really want to focus this week, and you just need some focus. You need some peace. Maybe there's a sense that there's a decision looming. That boyfriend or girlfriend that you kind of left behind to come here. Maybe you kind of know things aren't really going to work out long term, and you need some courage to do something about that. Or maybe it's a decision about the future, and you either need wisdom about what to do or courage to do what you already kind of know. Some of you are probably really thinking about faith for the first time, really thinking about it, and you're like, God, I could really use a sign, or I could use some indication or somebody to say something to let me know that this is the track that I'm supposed to go on, or God, could you kind of answer a prayer in a way that would let me know that you're really here? And if you start talking to people and passing the mic around, we all need something from God. And if you don't need something now, you're going to need something at some point in the future. And so this raises some important questions for us. To whom does God provide? Can we trust God to provide? And this is why I'm really glad that we've come this morning to this point in Elijah's story, because Elijah was a man, just a human being, just like us. And we have come to a point in the story where Elijah needs God to provide because he was following the Lord, he needs God to provide. He spoke this prophecy that it would not rain, and it stopped raining. And then the brook dries up, and there is a famine in the land, which means there's no food. There's no water, so the crops can't grow. The livestock can't eat. The livestock start dying. There's no grain. People are starving to death, and Elijah is not outside of it. He's right there in the middle of it. He needs God to provide. And where we pick up this morning is when God tells him how he's going to do it. This happens in 1 Kings chapter 17, and I'm going to read through starting in verse 8 down through about verse 15. So then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Now, the Lord says, I've directed a widow there. I've directed someone there to supply you with food. And I don't know about you, but my mind would think if God has directed someone to take care of Elijah's needs, it's going to be somebody that has extra. This is going to be somebody that has a spare bedroom, somebody that has enough food for themselves and extra to share for Elijah. Clearly, those are the type of people that God is going to use to provide for the people that are doing God's work. But God is kind of funny. He doesn't look at things the way we do, and he doesn't work the way that we do. There was this one time, many, many years after this, like 800 years after this, when Jesus was in the temple, and he took his disciples, and he went into the part of the temple where people were making their offerings to the temple, their financial gifts to the temple, and he posted up in a spot where he could watch what people were giving, which is really asocial behavior. I mean, if you did this at church, if you kind of like looked at the plates and like, as I was walking by, it's a really weird thing to do. But Jesus did not roll like we rolled. And so he sits there with his disciples, and all of these very wealthy people are coming and putting these extravagant gifts into the offering. And Jesus just kind of watches that go by. And then this little elderly widow comes up, and she puts 2 very tiny coins in the offering, 2 little pennies. And Jesus perks up, and he elbows his students, and he says, "Did you see that? Did you see what just happened? That woman put in more than all the rest, because they gave out of their wealth, but she, poor as she is, she gave all that she has to live on." So he's looking at things differently. And that's important to know, because everywhere we go, there's all these ladders to climb and all these hierarchies. I mean, whether it's athletics, the person that's at the top of the heap is the person that's the best. And if that's you, great, good. Or academics, you got the valedictorian and the salutatorian and whatever. Or it's like student politics, the student president and all that stuff. Or it's like the gamer culture, or it's like the arts, whoever is, got the lead role, the ingenue, and then you've got the character actors or whatever, and there's like this hierarchy. And those are all great. And, in every human endeavor, people are better than other people, or people have different roles. But in the endeavors of God, he doesn't look at those hierarchies that we set up for themselves. In fact, so often, he looks down here. God looks low. When God came himself, he came as a handyman, a carpenter, born in a no-place town, not a celebrity pastor, not a flashy person. In fact, he came in so low that most of the people that met him missed that he was God. And those that heard his claims about himself flat out denied it. They were like, no way this guy is God. So God doesn't look at things the way that we look at things, and he doesn't pick the person that you might think God would pick. We experienced that a little bit when we were trying to raise all that money. We started to pray, and it was like, the only way this is ever going to happen is if God does it somehow. And also, I have no plan. I don't even know how to start. So we started to pray, and my team that was with me, we all started to pray together. And what emerged out of some pretty intense prayer was this feeling that is what God wanted us to do. Not to come up with some kind of campaign or start asking people for money, or maybe we would do that at some point, but for right now, that God just wanted us to get people praying for this project. That we were about to get in the ring with Mike Tyson, and before we started taking those punches, we needed a lot of people in our corner. So what emerged was this sense that we wanted to get people to commit to pray, and we wanted 100 people praying for this project every day, and 1 person fasting, which means you go without food for the day, and you reinvest that time and energy to focus on the Lord and focus on this project. And we didn't just want a bunch of people on a list. We wanted to know there was 100 people praying on Tuesday and there's one person fasting on Tuesday. And so when we went out to start recruit people, if people were like, oh yeah, sure, I'll pray for you every day, we'd be like, well, fine, great, but tell me which day you're going to pray for us. Because I want to know if you say you're going to pray on Wednesday that you're really going to take a few minutes on Wednesday to pray for us. If you pray the other days, great. But I'm not just looking to have a fancy list. I'm actually looking to get people to actually really pray about this project. And if you think about it, that is kind of the most ridiculous way to go about this. We felt like it's what God wanted us to do. But from a certain lens, you could look at that and be like, that's your plan? To get people to talk to the air? That's how you're going to do this? I mean, if I went into a bank with a business plan and it was like, page 1, get 100 people to pray every day, get one person to fast every day, and I was like, that's as far as we've gotten. There's no way they're giving me that loan. That's a ridiculous plan. But sometimes God works through things that seem kind of ridiculous. And this is the case for Elijah. So Elijah obeys, verse 10. So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me a piece of bread, please. Now that's where it kind of triggered her. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. Now, I'm not sure that we can really understand how desperate a famine is, because we just don't go through famine. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's one or two of you that lived in another country for a while where you experienced famine, but the way we manage resources in the United States, most of us have probably never missed a meal. Maybe some of you, maybe one or two of you have grown up in a situation where you missed a meal, but most of us haven't missed a meal except when we've chosen to do it, and it was just, one meal. Famine is like everything dries up. Everything dries up. There's long lines at the grocery store or whatever the 8th century BC equivalent of that is. Everything dries up, there's long lines, and then there's nothing. And then people start dying, and they get desperate, and horrible things happen. This woman's ribs were sticking out. Her eyes her cheeks were sunken and sallow. Her son was probably laying in the bed all day, listless, with no energy to get up. This is an absolutely desperate situation. And she has just a little tiny bit of flour left and a little bit of oil. And Elijah has caught her at her last moments when she's giving up. She's out gathering a few sticks so she can make a little fire, so she can make a little loaf of bread, so she and her son can have a couple bites left to eat before they die. And Elijah says, make me a loaf of bread. Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the Lord sends rain on the land. Now it's ridiculous. I mean, what he's asking her to do is, he's asking her for everything. Every last little thing that she owns, and her son, the life of her son. He's asking for, it's absolutely ridiculous. Plus, what difference could it possibly make? What difference could a little few bites of bread make for Elijah? Why do this? That little bit that she has. What could God possibly do with that? And we felt that. I mean, we really felt that. When we worked. And 3 months in, it was working, but we had maybe 30 people a day praying, and we had maybe 10 days of the month covered with people fasting. And then some pressure started to come on, like, hey, you guys need to start raising money for this thing. There's deadlines. Stuff needs to come together. And we get it. The prayer support is great, but it's time to start also working the financial support. But we just felt this sense that God wanted us to focus on that prayer support, to get that prayer support together. And so it was all hands on deck. I mean, we were calling people and on social media and asking people to refer people. And every time we got a chance to get in front of a church, I was asking people, can you please sign up to pray for us? And we saw 40 people a day, 50 people a day. Some days had 60 or 70 people a day. And then the calendar started to kind of fill up. 20 of the days we had somebody fasting. Randomly, we'd have like 2 people fasting on a particular day. And this took months, 4 months in, 5 months in. We're still really, we're doing other things, but we're still really focused on this ridiculous feeling, this sense from God that this is what he wanted. And Elijah says, make me a loaf of bread first. And then we come to what may be one of the most incredible verses of Scripture. It blows your mind to even think that this went down this way. Verse 15. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. Whew. I'm not sure I can say I would in her shoes. But she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So our questions, can we trust God? Will God provide? One of the key thoughts in this text is that the only way you can find out whether you can trust God is to trust God. You actually have to trust God. You have to do the thing. You'll never know otherwise. You never know. I can tell you all day long, you can trust him, but you'll never know otherwise. You'll never know unless you actually trust God. You've got to actually stop doing that thing or start doing the thing. Maybe it's as simple as you've always wanted to read through the Bible and you've just got to start reading a chapter a day. If you read a chapter a day, eventually you will read through the whole Bible. And then find out, can you trust God to provide the insight and the wisdom and the interest and the sustainability, and when you miss a day to get back on the horse and all the rest of that. But unless you do the thing, you don't find out. And we've come to a point where Elijah trusted God and went to Zarephath to this widow, and then the widow has trusted the man of God and has given him the last. She went off and did what he said. She baked the bread, and instead of giving it to her starving son, she gave it to him. And then you find out. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. We really stuck with it, and before long, there was 100 people praying every day, and we had a person fasting every day, and sometimes 2 people and 3 people, and then it was like that flywheel was spinning, and then we had 110 people praying every day, and 120 people praying every day, and then we had 2, 3 people praying. Some days we had 5 people praying, and it all settled out to where we had between 120 and 130 people, and 2 to 5 people fasting, praying every single day of the month. And on days when I felt low, like I didn't know how I was going to put one foot in front of the other, I would pull up that Google Calendar and see all those people praying, lit up like a Christmas tree because we'd color-coded all the days that they were praying, and it would just give me that strength to know we had that many people in our corner to do this thing. Then we started asking people for money. Not a lot. It was weird. My home church came in with this huge gift right off the bat, and then like 2 or 3 other churches matched that right off the bat. And I'm not going to say I didn't work, because I did. And there were some sleepless nights. And there were some ups and downs. I mean, there were some instances where, a buddy's church, I was sure that they were going to be able to support us, and then it turned out that they weren't going to be able to. So it's not like everything was smooth sailing. But in about 5 months, we had $1 million. God just provided. 6th grade math teacher without a lead in the world. And it just came together. Now, here's what happens when that happens. Here's what I can't promise you and what God does not promise you. This is not a promise that if you trust God, everything is going to work out the way that you want it to. In fact, it's really not. Not too long after this woman's son gets sick and he dies. And I've been through situations like that, where I followed God, and the thing that he asked me to do, we did the thing, and then wham, life just punched me in the gut not too long after that. If anything, there's a promise that the opposite will happen. Jesus promises that in this world you will have trouble. And I know that is not a popular way to think about our faith. Anyone who's selling something won't sell you that faith. But Jesus also said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. And so trusting God to provide doesn't mean that he's going to necessarily give you what you think you want or what you think you need. And most of us don't even really know what we want anyway. We get what we want and then we're still unhappy. But God does. God knows what's best for us. Trusting God means that if you follow God, he will give you what you need to do his will. You can trust God to provide if you trust God to provide. Now, in this instance, Elijah miraculously prays for her son, and he comes back to life. And that leads me to the other thing that this text promises us, and that is that if you trust God, then you'll know that he is real. He raises her son from the dead, and listen to what she says. Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Now I know. You know, when I share that story about raising $1 million, I share it because sometimes like a big figure like that can help people believe. But it's small things too. I came out of that bathroom at the restaurant with this feeling like, okay, this is how I should bring this up. And I told my mom what I was thinking, and she gave me a hug afterwards. Whether what you need God to provide is something little or something that feels big or something that is big, it's the same thing. You've got to trust God to provide, and then you've got to trust God. And when you do, then you know. Then you know. See, I shared that story about raising that $1 million, and for you, maybe that does something to you. Or maybe you hear that and you're like, whatever, I don't know this guy. That happened over there. I'm thinking about my life. But that's just the point. I know. Because it's something I prayed for, and God did it in my life, and nobody can ever take that away from me. You can't argue me out of that kind of faith, because now I know. And that is the faith that I want you to have. If you take the leap and find out, then you'll know. And nobody will ever be able to take that away from you. It's something that you can take to the bank for the rest of your life. When times are hard, or when it feels like God isn't providing, or it feels like he's far away, or it's way too rough, you can always think back. I can always think back and say, but don't you remember that you had no leads? There was no way this could happen. It was impossible, and yet it did happen. And if you are going to follow the Lord on this great adventure, he's going to put you right out on the edge. Believe me, he will. He's going to put you right out on the edge where here's the limit of what you can do, and he's going to say, take another step. And when you're right outside of the edge of what you feel like you can do, or what you feel like you could handle, or what you feel like is possible, and you need God to provide, the only way to find out is to just step off that brink. And so you've got to do the thing. And maybe it seems silly. Maybe it seems like a couple bites of bread, like how could that possibly make a difference? When you guys come back here to the session here tonight, we're going to have these railroad switches set up around the room, and you're going to have an opportunity to get your life back onto the right track, to publicly say, I've been on the wrong track, I want to get back on the right track. Or maybe for the first time in your life, I'm starting to believe this stuff about Jesus, and I want to see where this goes. I'm going to throw my lot in with him. And maybe that just seems like a little thing. What difference could it possibly make to stand up and walk down the bleachers, or walk forward, or go back to one of the switches and pull this little thing and let your friends know and let your leaders know there's something going on inside of you? What difference could that possibly make? Well, I can tell you what, there's only one way to find out. You've got to trust God. And if you trust God, you can trust God to provide. We miss him because we're not looking low enough. There's a famous psychologist, Carl Jung, who said, man does not see God because he doesn't look low enough. And a lot of times we miss him because we're not looking low enough. We think, what difference could it possibly make? I've only got these 2 small coins. I've only got this little loaf of bread, or this little thing that seems kind of silly, or how could prayer possibly change things? But we're missing God because we're not looking low enough. I want to tell you where $300,000 of that $1 million came from, and I need to kind of protect this guy's identity, so I'm going to change the profession, but it's kind of like this. He's like an EMT. worker that I was in a Bible study I led a few years prior. And what happened was, in the meantime, he married this young woman who was the daughter of a family that was a very wealthy family of Christians that had this huge fund that they used to fund ministries all over the world. And they ended up supplying $300,000 for our project over the course of the next few years. They would just drop these $50,000 gifts on us right at the moment when we needed it too, right? When we were like, how are we going to make payroll? They would come through with something that we needed. But that guy, he was just an EMT in a Bible study that I taught years earlier. Can you imagine if I missed that because I had some kind of chip on my shoulder? What if I had gone into my life like God is calling me to plant churches, and so you know who he uses to fund churches? Millionaires, people that have. So that's who I'm going to focus my attention on. I'm going to focus my attention on the movers and the shakers. Can you imagine? I would have missed out on the single greatest donor that came through to that project. But we don't see God because we're not looking low enough. So it may seem like a little thing to you. And you may be wondering, and if you're not now, you will at one point, can I trust God? And I'm telling you, there's only one way to find out. You've actually got to trust God, and then you'll know. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so I actually think I can show you what this feels like better than I can tell you what this feels like. And I'm going to need some volunteers for the audience to do this, because I'm going to do something that maybe is the dumbest thing I've ever done. I want to trust fall off this stage onto, I need 15 relatively strong young gentlemen to come down here, please. If you feel like you got it, come down here. Come down here. I need like 15 guys. This is a good start. And you guys can just make a couple lines, link up arms. Okay, that probably does it. You guys get in there and make sure crowd in there, link up arms, and you got to squeeze tight. You can thread arms together or whatever. Okay. Now, if you follow God, he's going to bring you right to the brink, right to the edge of what you can do and what you can't do. And he's going to ask you, he's going to invite you, take another step. It feels like you can't stop doing this thing, but you can with my help. It feels like you can't do this thing, but you can with my help. And you won't find out whether he'll provide, whether or not you actually take that step. So just to be clear about what's happening right here, I represent you. These guys represent God. So don't drop me. All right, here's what it looks like if you trust God. Oh! Good, go ahead. You can do it. Thank you guys very much. God bless you all.